I've always loved riding my bike at night. There's something special about the cool, quiet air and the darkness that wraps everything around you. There was a narrow, shadowy trail near my house, the place I often went for my nighttime rides. I knew this path well. I'd ridden it countless times before without ever encountering anything strange. But that night was different. It would stick in my memory forever. As I rode quickly, the beam from my bike light sliced through the shadows, illuminating the narrow path ahead. The trees lining the sides of the trail seemed like dark fortresses, casting long shadows in every direction. I navigated the twists and turns easily, but something unusual caught my attention at an unexpected moment. As I approached a sharp bend in the trail, I noticed something to my right, just past the tree line. There was a figure standing there. I barely had time to register it, but as the light from my bike hit it for a split second, I saw a human-shaped shadow, almost indistinguishable in the dark. It was standing completely still. I passed by quickly, my mind racing. Had I really seen someone standing in the woods? My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to brush it off. It could have been a trick of the light or my imagination. Still, something didn't feel right. I continued on, but the unease lingered. The trail I was on was a loop, with the entrance and exit being the same path. So when I turned back, I would have to pass the same spot again. Minutes passed, and I completed the loop. As I approached the place where I'd seen the figure, my anxiety built. I didn't want to see it again. My eyes were glued to the trail ahead of me, and I avoided looking into the dark woods when I reached that spot. But this time, I couldn't avoid it. There, in the middle of the path, stood the same figure. It was more defined now. I could make out more details. It appeared to be a man, though it was still hard to tell in the dark. His legs were apart, blocking my way. He wasn't moving. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. There was only one way out. This was the only path to take. I had to pass him. "Move out of the way!" I shouted, but there was no response. He just stood there, silently. I pressed down on the pedals, trying to get past him as quickly as I could. But as I drew closer, he suddenly lunged at me. My heart sank. In that instant, I realized what was happening. He was trying to push me off my bike. I swerved to the left, narrowly missing the trees on the side of the trail as I tried to avoid him. His hands reached out, and I could feel the danger as he attempted to grab me. In a desperate attempt to defend myself, I kicked my right leg out toward him. I wasn't sure if it hit his shoulder or his arm, but part of his body collided with mine as he tried to shove me off my bike. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. I wasn't sure how, but by some miracle, I managed to stay upright on my bike. I didn't crash into the trees on the left. With a surge of adrenaline, I squeezed past him, pedaling furiously. I pushed myself harder, as fast as I could, until I finally made it back home. That night, I contacted the authorities, telling them about the man on the trail. I hoped they might still find him there when they arrived, but deep down, I knew it was unlikely. I wasn't sure if he was trying to rob me or if he just wanted my bike, but either way, he was crazy enough to try to attack me while I was riding. I still ride that trail regularly, but now I always carry a firearm with me, just in case. You never know when you'll find yourself in the shadows again. I've always enjoyed riding my bike in quiet, remote places, far from the noise of everyday life. The year after I graduated from college, I decided to embark on an unforgettable adventure, a long-distance cycling trip across Australia. It was a challenging journey that took me across vast distances and through many isolated places, filled with strange and memorable experiences. But there is one night from that trip that remains etched in my memory, a night that I'll never forget. I had spent weeks cycling through Western and Southern Australia. The days passed slowly, immersed in the soft sounds of nature, the rhythmic hum of my bike tires on the rough dirt roads. The journey was largely uneventful, with nothing out of the ordinary. But that evening, everything changed. That evening, I found myself riding beside a massive pipeline that ran parallel to the highway. The pipe twisted and turned with the landscape, following the contours of the earth. As dusk settled in, I decided to find a quiet spot to camp. I needed a rest, so I veered off the rough road and headed deeper into the land. The further I went, the more I felt as though I was leaving civilization behind. The road narrowed, the sounds of passing vehicles faded, and soon I was enveloped by the solitude of the land. After a while, I came across something strange, a small forest with what seemed like overgrown ruins peeking through the trees. Stone walls jutted out from the earth, remnants of houses long abandoned. The place felt eerie, but also fascinating, as if nature had quietly reclaimed what had once been a part of human history. Despite the strange atmosphere, I decided it was a perfect place to camp. I stopped and set up my tent, making sure the area was clear of debris and underbrush. After a quick dinner, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. It was around 8 p.m., and the darkness had quickly swallowed up the forest around me. I had grown used to camping alone at night. Being outdoors in the quiet of the wilderness was nothing new for me. But that night, something was different. The first thing I noticed was the unsettling silence. Usually, the forest is full of sounds, whether comforting or intimidating. But this night, the silence was almost oppressive. There was no rustling of leaves, no chirping of insects, no calls from distant animals. Nothing. Just stillness. I lay in my sleeping bag, straining my ears, hoping to hear any sound, perhaps the chirp of crickets or the rustle of some small creature, but there was nothing. Eventually I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking with purpose. I held my breath, trying to figure out what it was. It was definitely footsteps, distinct, sharp. But I couldn't think of any animal that walked in such a way. The intervals between the steps were oddly spaced, like someone was taking their time, moving carefully around me. I froze. My mind raced. Should I confront whatever was out there? Should I grab my torch and go outside to see who, or what, was in the woods with me? Or should I stay quiet and wait? The footsteps continued, circling my tent, getting closer and then retreating. I couldn't tell if the person, or whatever it was walking around me or just lingering nearby, but I could feel the tension building. I debated what to do for what felt like hours. My grip on the shovel I had near me tightened as I waited, frozen in place. The footsteps didn't stop. They continued their strange dance around my tent, sometimes fading into the distance, only to circle back. I was sure I wasn't imagining it. The sound was unmistakable. It was as if something or someone was toying with me, carefully watching from the shadows. Finally, exhaustion took over. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, the sun was peeking through the trees, casting light into my tent. Outside, the forest was alive again with the sounds I had missed earlier, birds chirping, the wind rustling through the leaves. I quickly scanned the area around my tent, hoping to find some clue about what had happened during the night, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs that anything had been near my tent at all. It was as if the forest had swallowed up the events of the previous night, returning to its natural state without a trace of the strange happenings. I hurriedly packed up my gear, shaken, but relieved to be leaving. As I rode back toward the pipeline and the highway, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled deep inside me. I was certain that what had happened that night wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something had been out there, circling my tent, and I didn't know what it was, but I would never forget it. I lived in a busy city, where the noise of traffic filled the air. For me, biking was my preferred mode of transportation. I rode my bike often to avoid dealing with traffic, but I also just enjoyed the freedom of being away from the congested streets. I simply loved biking. My bike was a bit heavy, a single-speed model, and although it was perfect for short trips, it always turned into quite a workout whenever I had to ride uphill. One evening, I decided to head to the grocery store to pick up a few essentials. The route I took passed through a large park, the same park I had biked through several times before. I knew every corner and every path in that park, but that night was different. I was riding my bike on the dirt trail that circled the perimeter of the park, enjoying the quiet that filled the place. But as I approached one of the hills, a strange feeling began to creep over me. The climb was particularly difficult, and the weight of the bike felt heavier than usual. I paused for a moment, thinking about it, and then I heard something strange. Footsteps, clear and distinct. They weren't my own. They were the footsteps of someone else. Suddenly, I didn't feel alone anymore. The footsteps were coming from behind me, and they seemed to be getting closer. The rhythm of the steps was steady, each footfall following the other in a consistent beat. At first, I wasn't sure where the sound was coming from, but as time passed, it became unmistakable. The sound grew louder, and it was impossible to mistake it now. It was the sound of someone running. I quickly turned my head, trying to see who was behind me, but I couldn't make out anyone. I wasn't sure if the person was running very fast, or if I was simply going too slow, but in that moment, I felt embarrassed. I didn't like the idea of someone passing me while I was riding so slowly, so I decided to give way to the runner. I veered to the right, expecting the person to zip past me quickly, but what happened next surprised me. The person didn't pass me. I continued pedaling, trying to speed up, but the sound of their footsteps remained right behind me, growing clearer with each second. It was obvious that the person was very close, as if we were in some kind of race. I began to feel anxious. I didn't want to risk looking back while climbing the hill, afraid that I might hit a rock or a hole in the dirt trail. I slowed down a bit, trying to let this person overtake me, but nothing happened. The footsteps kept pace with me, as if the person was walking in the exact rhythm of my own pedals. Their steps were still behind me, not passing me, just steadily following. Eventually, when I couldn't bear the strange feeling any longer, I decided to stop my bike completely. I moved off the path and onto the grass, ready to turn around and confront whoever was behind me. Maybe it was just a quick jogger, or maybe there was another explanation. When I turned around, the surprise was overwhelming. There was no one there. No one was behind me. The trail was empty. No footsteps, no sign of anyone. Just silence. I stood there for a moment, in disbelief, trying to understand what had just happened. I was absolutely sure I had heard someone behind me. Their steps were too clear for me to have imagined them. I scanned the area, my eyes sweeping over the entire park, looking for any clue as to what had happened, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no trace of anyone. The place was eerily quiet, and the atmosphere was still, as if nothing had ever occurred. The person, or the runner, had vanished without a trace. I stood there for a while, trying to process what had just taken place. But all I felt was confusion. I was certain I hadn't imagined hearing someone else's footsteps, and the sound was so clear. But now, there was no evidence of what had happened. Finally, I decided to continue on my way. I got back on my bike and tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. I made my way to the grocery store, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. That night, back home, I started looking up more information about the park I had biked through. I discovered that the park had been built over an old cemetery, one that was primarily used for the poor. Some of the bodies had been moved, but not all of them. Estimates suggested that there were still around 2,000 bodies buried beneath the park. I even found stories from people who claimed to have seen apparitions or felt cold spots while walking through the park at night. Everything started to make sense. If the park was haunted, then perhaps what I had experienced that day was related to something supernatural. I wasn't sure exactly what it was, but I couldn't ignore the possibility. I still ride my bike through that park from time to time, but I no longer look back or ride there at night. Every time I do, a strange feeling creeps over me, even though nothing unusual has happened since that night. That summer evening was quiet, with the sun about to set, when I decided to ride my bike and head to the grocery store. I was about 9 or 10 years old at the time, and my life was as simple as it always was during the summer in the countryside. We lived in an isolated farmhouse, and the nearest town, which was several miles away, was the closest urban center. In moments like these, I greatly enjoyed the freedom that the bike gave me, especially as I could avoid the traffic of the city streets, which made me feel a sense of independence. The neighborhood we lived in was not crowded. It was very quiet and still most of the time. My brother and I rode our bikes everywhere, and we never felt scared. We felt completely safe in this place, far away from the hustle and bustle of the cities. One of the roads I was accustomed to taking was the one that passed through a large park near our home. I had ridden along that path many times before and knew every corner and turn by heart. But that night, everything felt different. That evening, I decided to go to the store to pick up some things we needed. I took the usual route, riding my bike along the dirt path that wound around the park. As I approached a small hill on the road, I felt something strange. The bike felt heavier than usual, and the road was a bit more difficult. But I also felt like something was off. The sound of my feet pedaling mixed with something else, something I couldn't identify at first. Then, as I rode my bike along the path, I suddenly heard the sound of footsteps behind me. The footsteps were clear, rhythmic, as if someone was running behind me. I stopped for a moment, wondering if someone was getting closer, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps grew louder, as if the person was approaching me quickly. The sound was repetitive and steady, and the distance between their footsteps and mine gradually decreased. Something strange crept into my heart, something I couldn't ignore. The sound of the footsteps wasn't natural. There was something about it that made me feel increasingly anxious. My feelings went from curiosity to fear. I knew I needed to speed up, but I didn't dare stop or look behind me. Up until that moment, my brother and I had ridden here countless times without ever encountering any danger, but this time, everything felt different. I felt a weight in my chest. I pedaled faster, trying to distance myself from the strange sound that was getting closer. I tried to move further and further ahead, but the sound remained behind me, as if the person were trying to catch up. My heart began to race. I thought about stopping and turning around to see who was behind me, but I was afraid I might stumble on the dirt path. So, I decided to keep going. Then, in a moment of panic, I decided to make way for this person to pass me. I shifted my bike to the right side of the path, but strangely, the sound didn't go away. The person didn't pass me. Instead, the sound continued to grow closer. I glanced back quickly, trying to see who was behind me, but I saw no one. The path behind me was completely empty. My heart pounded harder, and I wondered what was happening. In that moment, my whole body was on high alert. Everything around me felt more mysterious. I pedaled faster, driven by a sense of panic, my eyes scanning everywhere around me. The sound was still behind me, but there was nothing ahead or behind. The faster I pedaled, the more it felt like I was running from something unknown. In a state of terror, I sped up even more. But then, suddenly, without warning, a car stopped in front of me. It was a dark-colored station wagon, driven by two men who appeared to be in their 40s. As they got closer, they rolled down their window and began calling out to me. They suddenly asked, in an irritating manner, which one of them was cuter. Those words were enough to make my heart freeze. I'm not sure why, but I felt something strange deep inside me, something that made me pedal faster, as fast as I could. The men's voices became clearer, and it only made me feel more frightened. I rode quickly, my bike racing down the dirt road. I glanced behind me quickly and saw the car following me, getting closer. I screamed at the top of my lungs, hoping my mom would hear me, but she was a little too far away. My heart was pounding, and all I could hear was the sound of my bike wheels spinning as fast as they could go. Thankfully, my mom had heard me. She saw me running toward her, and she too ran toward me, her face showing a mix of concern and confusion. As we neared our driveway, the men must have seen my mom approaching. Suddenly, without warning, they slammed on the brakes and turned the car around, heading back down the gravel road, away from us. I didn't stop pedaling until I reached my mom. She had called the police, and they arrived quickly to take information. I told them everything I remembered about the car and the men's faces, but there wasn't much they could do. There weren't enough details to go on, so I don't think they ever found them. Even though I didn't encounter them again, I still had the unsettling feeling that something strange had happened, something that couldn't be explained. The incident was terrifying in a way I can't describe, especially because I had always felt so safe in our rural area. It was unusual for something like this to happen in such a quiet place. I had seen that car up close, and I had heard its sound. To this day, I can't forget that moment when we felt fear near our home, a place that had always been a source of safety. That summer was hot, and the sun was just about to set when I decided to ride my bike. I was 8 years old at the time, and it was an ordinary day, as is typical for summer in the countryside. That day, I was with my friend, riding our bikes around the neighborhood, racing each other, and stopping occasionally for snacks. Those were some of the moments I enjoyed the most, especially as we were in this quiet village, far from the noise of the city. After a couple of hours, my friend had to go home, but I still felt like I wanted to ride around a bit more. I thought to myself that I could continue my ride alone for a few more minutes. What could happen? These were the moments of independence I loved, riding my bike through this place I knew so well, where trees lined the streets and the houses were spaced out in a way that made me feel safe. Everything felt calm, everything was in its place. I rode my bike down the dirt road that ran along the green fields, heading toward the quiet area I liked. The sky was shifting between shades of orange and red from the sunset, and the streets were nearly empty except for a few passing cars here and there. I passed through a familiar residential area, where large trees stood along the road. But then, in that moment, I noticed something strange. There was a white Volkswagen, not far behind me, following closely. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Cars passed through here all the time, and I thought maybe this was just another driver out for a leisurely afternoon. But as I continued, I started to feel that something was wrong. The car was staying behind me, and the distance between us wasn't increasing. I tried to ignore it at first. I made a left turn, then a right, thinking that maybe I was imagining things, but the car continued to follow me. The driver was staying close, no matter which way I turned. That's when I began to feel a bit nervous. I remembered what my father had taught me about safety and how to react if I felt threatened. He always told me, "If something feels off, don't hesitate to tell an adult." But at that moment, all I could think to do was pedal faster, trying to get away from the car. As I pedaled with all my might, the car suddenly stopped right next to me. A man got out of the car. He looked unkempt, with a scruffy beard and clothes that appeared as though they hadn't been washed in days. His smell was awful, as if it carried the stench of days gone by. He stood a little away from me on the curb, then crouched down to my level and asked if I was okay. "Are you all right?" he asked in a gruff voice, staring at me with narrowed eyes. I could only nod my head, nervously mumbling that I was fine and just riding my bike. I kept my eyes on him, trying to gauge his intentions. There was something about his behavior that felt wrong. Then he continued speaking, and what he said made my heart stop for a moment. "I'm a friend of your parents. They told me to come find you and take you to your grandmother's house. She needs you." Suddenly, every cell in my body froze. I knew very well that my grandmother had passed away 5 years ago. This man was not someone I knew. His words were completely false. But what disturbed me most was the fact that, at that moment, I was absolutely sure I could not believe him. There was no way he could be a friend of my parents, especially with that awful smell surrounding him. I simply said, "You're lying," and then quickly started pedaling as fast as I could. Every part of me was filled with fear, but I couldn't stop. I just wanted to get away from this man, and all I could think about was escaping as quickly as possible. As I sped away, I saw him reach out his hand toward my arm in an attempt to grab me. But I had already put enough distance between us to avoid his grasp. My feet were racing against time, and my eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the car still following me. I didn't dare look behind me. All I cared about was getting home as fast as I could. Each second felt like an eternity. When I finally burst through the front door of the house, my parents were in the living room. I was shaking, and my words were coming out in fragments as I told them everything. I felt safe now, but I was still in shock. My parents immediately called the police and described the type of car and the man who had been following me. Fortunately, the police were on their way to our house when they happened to pass by the white car I had noticed. They stopped immediately and arrested the man who was driving the car. His horrible smell was unmistakable, but that didn't matter now. After confirming that this was the man who had tried to grab me, the police took him away. I never knew what happened to that man afterward or what consequences he faced. I think my parents knew, but since I was so young, they told me not to worry about it and that I would be safe. Although the incident had been terrifying at the time, I felt a sense of relief after he was caught. It felt like everything had returned to normal. But I will never forget those moments, especially when I think back to the fear I felt when I was on the edge of danger.